Good afternoon. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are so pleased to welcome former White House Chief of Staff Denis Mcdonough to campus this afternoon. I want to mention a couple of upcoming events. Tonight at the Quadrangle Club, we will welcome former Secretary of the U.S. Navy Ray Mabus for a discussion on diversity in the modern military. This Wednesday, we have Laura Rosenberger and Jamie Fly of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, who will be in conversation with Kim Dozier about Russian efforts to undermine public faith in democracy. And Thursday, we will welcome former Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price. You can find out more about these and all upcoming events on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. Audience questions. We will open up the floor to take questions from the audience. We're going to have two mics, so we'll be alternating between those two mics in either aisle. And as usual, we give priority for the first three questions to students, and we remind you that questions end with a question mark, so please keep them brief and questionable. Please make sure your phones are on silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Madison Irene. Madison is a first year from Buffalo, New York, studying history, political science, and comparative human development. She is a member of the IOP's Women in Public Service program. Please join me in welcoming Madison to the podium.
Hi, everyone. I am very excited to introduce to you the former White House Chief of Staff during President Obama, Denis Mcdonough. Originally from Minnesota, Mr. Mcdonough grew up 9th out of 11 brothers and sisters, and Mr. Mcdonough served as the senior foreign policy advisor during Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. Soon after, in 2010, Mr. Mcdonough became assistant to the president and principal deputy security national advisor. And in 2013, Mr. Mcdonough became the White House Chief of Staff. He had many successes during his term, including increasing the diplomatic relations with Cuba, the strategic arms talks in Russia, and the Iran nuclear deal. While in his position, Mr. Mcdonough was known for being a stickler for the process and was said to have taken control over the White House staff more than any other. At the end of his term in 2016, Nancy Pelosi was quoted as saying that the person Mr. Mcdonough was most like was President Barack Obama himself. Mr. Mcdonough now works as senior principal at the Markle Foundation, where he is working to address the skills gap in the workforce as artificial intelligence continues to revolutionize the workforce. His achievements are many. His knowledge in foreign policy, technology, national security, and White House management only begin to scratch the surface of all of his accomplishments. Today, IOP Director David Axelrod will be leading this discussion. Mr. Axelrod has also worked with President Obama during both of his campaigns. So thank you all for coming out to the Speaker Series event, and here is Mr. Axelrod and Mr. Mcdonough.
Thank you.
Thanks, Madison. We can only scratch the surface of your whole portfolio and history.
It's very scratchy.
But I have to start by asking you about your observations of what you're seeing now. Madison mentioned some of the things that you worked on, Cuba, the climate, all of that.
Yeah.
There seems to be a persistent effort to unravel much of that. How do you react when you see all of that? I get that question a lot myself. Yeah. And as an adjunct to that question, you're an orderly guy. And one of the things that you brought to that office of the Chief of Staff was systemic order. And I'm wondering whether you look at John Kelly and say, man, I wouldn't want to be that guy.
Yeah. Well, I do. Madison, thanks very much for the introduction. It's really good to be here. I'll tell you what I miss about the White House is, in our time in government, is working with people like you and Shayla. And
Shayla Murray is here, former senior advisor to President Obama and a member of the advisory board for the Institute of Politics and a former fellow at the Institute of Politics. So.
Yeah, and a great patriot. So it's really good to be with you guys.
We only have great patriots.
Yes. So yeah, I guess two things on your last question, Axe. It's how do I feel about it? I'm disappointed. But some of these things, I think, by virtue of the rightness of our position, will reassert themselves. The good news on the climate deal is that the United States cannot formally get out of the deal until after the next general election. My hunch is that climate energy will be a big issue to be hammered out in the 2020 elections. And I think what you'll see is the same thing that we witnessed when we were in the government, which is that this is an extraordinarily important issue for a lot of voters. And so I think things like that will come back. I'm very proud of things like the Affordable Care Act. You know, nobody poured more into that than you. But to not only see that survive a very concerted onslaught, but to see it, in fact, thriving. That numbers in terms of enrollment through the independent marketplaces that are established under the Affordable Care Act being actually quite stable at the moment, notwithstanding the fact that the government has done everything that it could do, short of repealing the law, which they proved they could not do, to undermine it. So I have great pride in that. And then ultimately, look, it's not like I'm going to say that I feel great when I see all the work that we poured into this being attacked. But I guess I feel quite confident that we pursued these issues based on both the fact that they're in the national interest and that there's a logic to it. And the logic held together from some larger theme or some larger idea. And so I think the fundamental weakness in the opposition to these things is that they're just against them because they're somebody else's idea, which is why at the end of the day they're going to be less successful than they're intending to be to get rid of it.
One of those ideas or one of those initiatives was the Iran nuclear agreement. We've got a deadline coming up in May. Every indication from the president is that he wants to withdraw from that agreement unless President Macron, who's in Washington today, Chancellor Merkel coming later this week, can persuade him otherwise. What would the impact of withdrawal from that agreement be?
I think the biggest impact would be to isolate the United States while the rest of the world continues apace with the deal. I think what the French will be telling, what President Macron will be telling President Trump this week is that Europe will intend to continue with the deal even if the United States does not grant the waivers in May, which is the deadline that you're talking about. And so the result of this would be there's really kind of two options, right? One is we end up being on the outside of the rest of the world, continuing to try to make the deal work. And so rather than have an Iran that's isolated, we'd have the United States isolated.
Unless Iran itself withdraws from the deal and resumes its work, which is something they said they might do.
Second option is precisely that. First option is not good. Second option is worse, which is that Iran dusts off the program that they had, about which we now know much more than we even did before because of the presence of inspectors. They push out those inspectors, and they then proceed apace with the kind of program that we've long feared they would pursue. As I said, if the first option's bad, that option's worse, because then we're back on a path where an Iran is pursuing a nefarious and outlawed nuclear program, in which case we're back on a pathway towards confrontation. I don't see why that's in the United States' interest, particularly at a moment when we have a series of other challenges that we're trying to resolve. And, by the way, under the deal, we've now certified several times that Iran is living up to the deal, that its illegal program has been halted, and that they're not creating the kinds of facts on the ground that we obviously witnessed in the past that they had been making.
Mike Pompeo, who's been nominated for Secretary of State, the CIA director, has been very critical of the deal. He's been an advocate for pulling out of the deal. Do you expect that his appointment will make it more likely that we pull out of the deal? And should the Senate oppose him on that basis?
I think the curious thing about his opposition is that all the intelligence, at least as it has been presented to Congress, as I understand it, since he's been there, has suggested that they're living up to the deal. So he has been involved in a process that has certified the Iranians living up to the deal, but continues to oppose it. So I don't understand the substantive basis for his.
Well, the substantive basis is that they're doing things outside the realm of the deal that are aggressive in terms of development of their missile technology and so on.
Right, well, which he has an ideological objection to the deal. The deal was about the nuclear program. Mm-hmm. There's no question that everybody shares opposition to other nefarious activities that the Iranians are conducting in the region, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, and obviously against our ally in Israel. So the issue here is expressly on what we used to call the wolf closest to the door, the Iranian nuclear program. The deal is living up to its expectations. And so, part of what concerns me about his nomination acts is it does seem to be an ideological opposition.
But isn't he reflecting, I guess the question is, I'm asking you this as someone who's worked for a president. Yeah. I mean, I'm personally torn on this because I don't agree with Pompeo on a whole array of things, this being chief among them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the State Department's falling apart, and you know this. A lot of the senior level people have left, and there are fewer people, younger, junior people applying for the Foreign Service. There's a need for a Secretary of State, and is it likely that you're going to get a better candidate if he's rejected, or are you just going to leave that post vacant because of disagreements with Trump's foreign policy?
Well, look, I've avoided saying whether any of these nominations should go forward or not.
This is the perfect place to break that habit.
Yeah. In typical Axe fashion, you're kind of pressing the case, I've noticed. Let's set aside whether they should vote yea or nay. It looks like he's going to have a hard time getting out of the committee if that hasn't already happened. I heard it might happen today.
But we'll get to the floor.
We'll get to the floor. But if the question is the institution of the State Department and the health of that institution, I would be concerned that the guy who's coming in to lead the institution has just left the CIA, maintaining an ideological opposition to the Iran deal, notwithstanding the fact that, again, as I understand the certifications having been made to Congress, suggest that intelligence suggesting that they're living up to the deal. And so what we don't need is another head of an agency that doesn't listen to the professionals that staff those agencies.
He is the head of an agency right now, so he'll be giving the president advice on this one way or the other.
Yeah, he will. And he's, but he's, look, we'll see where the votes come down, Axe, but I'm reacting expressly to your question about whether somehow him taking over the vacancy in the building is going to restore the health of the institution. It's not going to restore the health of the institution if you have a leadership that doesn't listen to the professionals that have dedicated their lives to running that place.
Well, I applaud you for not taking a position on these appointments. I think you're. On North Korea.
Don't you see why I miss working with them so much?
On North Korea, because these are related issues.
Sure are.
Nuclear proliferation. They have weapons, and it is fair criticism, isn't it, to say a succession of American administrations, Republican and Democrat, including the Obama administration, never found a way to stop North Korea from proceeding down this path. And now they have, reached a dangerous point from the standpoint of American national security. In that sense, does Trump deserve any credit for pressing these sanctions and for, this brinksmanship if it changes their behavior?
Look, successive presidents, going back to the agreed framework in 1994, when we were very close to war with the North Koreans, have struggled with this issue. There's no question about that. We've pursued through Republican and Democratic administrations since then a policy to do two things. One is dramatically isolate the North Koreans, and two, to bring the Chinese on board to press the North Koreans to resolve this issue. The extent to which President Trump has increased pressure on both the Chinese and on the North Koreans, it's a continuation of what successive presidents have done, in which case he's building on the progress that each of those presidents had made. The extent to which he breaks through, here acts, and changes their behavior, I'll be the first to congratulate him. It's early to make that conclusion.
Are you worried about him being too eager for a deal here?
Yes. I'm worried that, Jake Sullivan wrote a very good piece in the Washington Post about 3 weeks ago now, where he talked about the dynamics of diplomatic negotiations always pushing towards an agreement. Once you're in the room, there's tremendous pressure to push toward an agreement. And you have to be, as a negotiator, be very careful to not fall into that trap and agree to something that's less than what your national interest needs. And so I do worry about that, because of what we've seen is premature declaration of success at different times under President Trump. And that would be very detrimental here, because simply because of the progress that North Koreans have made on their program, but also because of the fact that the Chinese and others are looking for reasons to back off pressuring North Korea. And we have to make sure that we keep that pressure on them until they live up to their fundamental commitment, which they've made time and time again, to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula.
Why didn't the President Obama ever meet with Kim Jong-un? Why has no president ever met with him before, met with North Korean leaders before? I think Madeleine Albright was the highest ranking official who ever met with a North Korean leader.
Well, the North Koreans have sought at various times for the legitimization that would come from such a meeting. They made a very strong push. Secretary Albright talked about this on Tommy Vitor's podcast relatively recently. Gave a very detailed history of the back and forth that they went through in the late in the year 2000. And successive presidents had determined that absent some concrete demonstration of intent to resolve those concerns about the nuclear program, they would not give the meeting, because the meeting itself was something of a diplomatic give to the North Koreans. And so President Obama even famously declared during the campaign, when you and I used to spend a lot of time together, that he'd be willing to meet with, at the time, Kim Jong-il. But there was never sufficient progress on these issues. In fact, as you just indicated a couple minutes ago, they've over successive administrations, successive years, increased their capability, demonstrated their unwillingness to live up to their responsibilities, such that no president until now thought it was an investment worth making.
How much you help prepare the president for bilateral meetings, some of extraordinary sensitivity. Are you concerned about this president's level of preparedness to sit down with a North Korean?
Look, I think this would be a very difficult meeting. And so, I'm worried about the preparation that goes into it. I'm worried about what happens on the back end of it. I'm worried about the fact that successive administrations had invested a lot, both in our treaty allies, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, the New Zealanders, them understanding precisely what we wanted out of this diplomacy, and then also the Chinese. Successive presidents have invested an awful lot of time in making sure that the Chinese understand that this problem and its solution is partly their responsibility too. But as near as I can tell, all those parties learned about the decision to have this meeting the same way that many of us learned about it.
Should they be at the table?
They surely should not be as surprised as they appeared to have been by the announcement of this meeting. And that strikes me as a pretty significant development that they were.
Let me ask you about Russia.
Yeah.
You, I guess the question is, what did you know about Russia and when did you know it?
Well, it's a big country. I knew that. Look, actually, you recall that we spent a lot of time in 09 and 10 into 11 investing in a relationship with the president of Russia at the time, Medvedev. And through that relationship, made significant progress on the strategic arms reduction, on Afghanistan, on work together against all sorts of other challenges to include terrorism.
Yeah.
So we all harbored hard-earned skepticism about then Prime Minister Putin and what he was going to be like if he came back into power. You'll recall that that was an open question, whether he'd come back to be president. And I think that skepticism has been borne out.
Yeah, but on the issue itself, because I want to get to a couple of other things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know what the criticism is, and you've responded to it before, but I want to ask you, with everything that's going on right now, well, actually, let me ask you a parenthetical question.
Yeah.
How do you feel about what Director Comey is doing right now?
Oh, I see. You're talking about the 2016 election
Yes,
in Russia.
yeah. I
see.
suspect they knew.
I was working chronologically through our years together.
I know. I know. This is called, Dennis is an old football player, and that's called a ball control offense.
Look, we saw developing from the Russians over the course of 2015, 2016, a real interest in messing with democratic institutions around the world. And then, as we've made clear, we saw very clearly in the summer of 2016 that they intended to mess with our democratic institutions too. We took a series of steps at the time that we thought would protect the principal interest we had, namely the democratic institutions and the democratic tools in this country. Voting rolls, voting machines, ensuring to the American people that their vote, when cast, would count.
This was the message that President Obama delivered to Putin in
Correct.
September of 2016.
Correct. And we think that that message hit the target.
But do you think that more should have been done to inform the public of what the Russians were doing?
You know, actually, I've said this a number of different times, and I've also thought about this an awful lot. You know, the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Homeland Security went out and made an unprecedented statement laying out what was happening at the time. And that was, we thought, an unprecedented statement at an unprecedented time.
You said that it was watered, that your efforts were watered down by Senator McConnell. In what way?
The second thing we tried to do, which is that we tried to, in order to protect the voting machines themselves and the voting rolls, which are maintained by state election officials in our country. Our elections aren't run by the federal government.
Right.
They're run by locally elected and locally controlled institutions that themselves are partisan, some Republicans and some Democrats. We determined that if we were to go out, the president alone or a Democratic White House alone to call attention to these issues, that there would be a lot of skepticism about what we were doing. So
because it would impute that motives to helping one side, namely Trump.
There would be at least, and in fact we witnessed over the course of the summer of 2016, certain local officials suggesting there was no problems with our system. That in fact, to suggest otherwise would be to politicize.
Just let me ask you this though: Did you know, sitting in the White House, that these efforts were aimed at helping one candidate and not the other?
I think the statement that Secretary Johnson and Director Clapper put out made clear that these guys had a view, and that was surely our conviction.
And was McConnell worried that you were going to go farther than that, and that somehow this would impugn the Republican candidate?
It's hard for me to characterize his views. I'll let him speak for himself on his views. What we did is the president asked the 4 leaders to develop a statement after sharing with them what we knew about what was happening. Asked them to develop a statement. In fact, it was the speaker who drafted the statement and shared it among the other leaders. And the statement that was ultimately agreed to was not the one that the speaker drafted. It was one that was eventually released, but did not even mention Russia. So, yeah, it was watered down. Mm-hmm. And that's a mistake, and that was a missed opportunity. That said, Secretary Johnson and Director Clapper still went out and made the statement that they made. And we, at every opportunity between then and the election day, tried to highlight our concern about what was going on. Several times in the briefing room, several times in other settings, Axe.
So you're satisfied that you guys did?
I'll never be satisfied. I'll never be satisfied. I believe that we made every effort to call attention to this issue. And then the question is, so what happened? Why didn't it get the attention it deserved? I think there's a lot to be asked about this. I think this Amy Chozick book is pretty remarkable. It's the first time anybody...
Hillary Clinton.
She covered Hillary Clinton through much of Secretary Clinton's political career since the Senate. But she talked a lot about how she, as a reporter now looking back at how she treated John Podesta's emails, how she feels about that. I find that remarkable. It's the first thing I've seen written by anybody in the press about that period. I've said now publicly several times that somehow between the period when Secretary Johnson and Director Clapper made that unprecedented statement about what the Russians were up to, that statement was covered far less than emails of a private American citizen who were stolen by the Russians were covered in our press. That's a mistake.
Well, he was a private citizen. He was also chairman of one of the campaign.
Well, these were emails. Okay. You're not. He was a private American citizen whose emails were stolen.
Look, he was a victim of a crime. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
So, because just in the interest of time, there are 2 things I have to cover before we go to questions from the audience. One of them is Syria. We just had another attack on Syria for the use of chemical weapons. Mm-hmm. This is something you famously wrestled with as chief of staff. President Obama, everyone knows, described this red line. The red line was crossed. Mm-hmm. You guys contemplated taking military action, and everyone was poised for it. The Secretary of State was preparing an announcement on it and so on. You guys took a walk around the lawn at the White House, and the president decided that he was going to take a different route. This will be brooded about forever.
Yes.
It's complicated.
Yes.
Do you have any second thoughts about the decision not to engage military action then? And how do you evaluate the steps that President Trump has taken?
So recall that the question at that moment in 2013 was whether to go to Congress before using military action, or to use military action before going to Congress. And
it's complicated because the British Prime Minister went to Parliament to ask for their approval, and they declined.
Well, it's also complicated by the United States Constitution, which Article 1, Section 9 declares that Congress, declares war and makes and raises armies, and Section 2, Article 2 makes clear that the president's commander-in-chief. And we've wrestled with this issue very deeply as a country for many years. And so this is always an interesting question. I did notice, as reported by Helene Cooper in the New York Times last week, that I gather Secretary Mattis argued to President Trump
go to Congress.
that he should go to Congress before using.
Yeah, because you're still operating under the 2002 authorization for the use of military.
So that was the question at the time. And so I've said a number of things about this act. I'll repeat a couple of them. One is the credible threat of the use of force in Syria, I believe, resulted in the Russians pressing Assad to do two things that he had not done theretofore. One, declaring the existence of a chemical weapons stockpile, and two, giving up a large portion of the stockpile and the machines used to create it at the time. The question, looking back at if we had chosen to use force before going to Congress, would we have gotten as robust an outcome as it relates to the chemical weapons program? I think the answer to that is no, we would not have. And that the diplomatic result we got was directly as a result of a concrete and clearly understood threat of the use of force. And you recall that now going back even into the Balkan War, Putin himself has views on these questions. He was very unhappy with what happened in Libya. He was very unhappy with the force that the United States used in the Balkans. So he understood a threat from President Obama to use force in Syria to be a very concrete and realistic threat, which is why he took the steps I believe he took with Assad.
You helped draft the authorization for the use of military force. You were working for Senator Daschle at the time that authorized the invasion of Iraq. A decision that also will be reflected on in history for a long time. What lessons did you learn from that experience that informed your thinking and advice to the president when he was considering Syria? Because the people who are unhappy about not having pursued military force at the time were really interested not just in getting rid of the chemical weapons, but as a means of destabilizing further Assad and giving a better chance to those who were opposing him to topple him.
Yeah. Well, look, I believe that that negotiation, which happened basically from Tuesday night, September 11th, until Friday morning, September 14th, when the negotiation of that resolution was done basically over the course of 3 pretty intensive days of negotiation, a relatively small group of people, and then ultimately, not in hearings, not in public markups, but rather in a closed-door negotiation, then voted on and overwhelmingly approved by all of the Senate and all but one member of the House. My reaction to that is, obviously it was important that Congress make the statement it made. It was very important that we negotiated and worked out that language that we worked out, but that there's a reason we do these things in regular order in open session and in public session, so that the American people can watch and witness that debate and understand why certain words and portions of the resolution are chosen, why other portions are not. And so...
Going back, do you think that was a mistake?
No, I don't
should it have
think
been worded differently? Should it have...
I think we've now had countless court hearings, countless court rulings about what those words mean, and so there's been a lot of jurisprudence built around them. I think that if anything, what should have been handled differently is that the markup should have been handled publicly in open session. I don't think that.
Would that have deterred? Would that have changed the decision to go into Iraq?
No, I don't think it would have. It wouldn't. I just think that public, open debate is always better than closed-door deliberations. Now, it's really hard to envision how we would have handled that differently. But you asked what my conclusions are, what my lessons are from that. One is public engagement and debate on these questions is best. Congress being involved before the action is started, also best. Incidentally, happens to be the position taken by countless presidents until now. And as I said, even reported by the New York Times last week, is Secretary Mattis's position on Syria last week.
And Congress would not have at that time, authorized a strike on Syria. Is that fair to say?
In 2013, in fact, they chose not to. We had a meeting where they all went very publicly afterwards to say that they were with the president and were going to support doing it, and then obviously changed position.
We're going to take questions in a few seconds here, but I'd be remiss, because you're in town on a different mission. Madison mentioned that you're now working on the issue of the future of work.
Yeah.
And this strikes me as the sort of central issue of our time, because technology has so changed our economies. And if you're on the right side of the digital divide, you're a winner. And if you're on the wrong side, and many are, you're in jeopardy. You're trying to impact on that.
Yeah, and what we're finding, I think, increasingly, Axe, is more and more people feel like they're on the wrong side of this, as you said, and you find yourself in jeopardy. So I think what people are finding is, their kind of historic belief in opportunity and dignity that comes with certain lines of work all of a sudden is not there. Things that their parents did before them, or that people in their town or their city or their county or their state did before them, are no longer available to them. So the question is, if places where people traditionally have gotten their career development, the dignity that comes from their work is not going to be there any longer, what will be the new opportunities, and how do we prepare our workers so that they're ready to compete in that kind of economy? So that's the answer. That's a question we're seeking an answer to. A lot of people here have done a really remarkable job in Chicago on this. Everybody from Secretary Pritzker and the Chicagoland Skills Initiative to Mayor Emanuel himself to Boeing and Caterpillar and other companies who are trying to make big decisions like this. And then obviously institutions like University of Chicago, Northwestern, Loyola, and others also trying to make these decisions. So that's our goal. We'll have a big meeting here tomorrow, and I'm optimistic about this, but I'm also eyes wide open about the size of the challenge.
Yeah, please line up behind these mics to ask questions. My last question is, what is government's role in that? Because you speak a lot about business's role and education's role. What is the role that government can and should play in helping the country through this transition?
Marco Foundation worked with Pew to do an interesting poll in Colorado a couple years ago, where it found something like 90% of what was termed middle-skilled workers. They say workers who had some post-high school education, but not a Bachelor of Arts, not a 4-year degree. 90% of the respondents recognize that they need to learn new skills over the course of their life. They recognize that it's their responsibility to do so. Therefore, they wanted to do so. But something like 35% of them were aware of available, economical, reasonable training options to do that. So you have 9 in 10 workers know that they need to retool and reskill, except 4 in 10 can find places to reskill. That's a market imperfection. I think that's squarely where the government has a public policy role, which is, where can we make more training, more reskilling opportunities available for workers?
Go ahead.
Thank you for speaking with us today, sir. My name is Zubair. I'm a third year from New York. And my question is about the AUMF. So
Yes.
President Trump now has authorized force against Syria twice, and both of those times have fallen outside the jurisdiction of the AUMF. And the media has also described an ongoing quote-unquote shadow war occurring in North Africa and the Middle East, and I believe that also falls outside of the jurisdiction. So do you believe that the AUMF needs to be updated to today's reality, and how much flexibility do you think it should allow the president compared to where we were after 9/11?
Well, I've been very impressed by the ongoing negotiation between Senator Kaine of Virginia and Senator Corker, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee from Tennessee. And I do think that, and we enunciated this position when we were still in government, that an update to the AUMF is due, if not overdue. I think that Senators Kaine and Corker have a good place to start with their proposal that they put out there about 10 days ago. I might quibble a little bit with your suggestion that these things that have happened, either as you're suggesting, some about North Africa or the Syria things, are definitely outside the scope. I think that's a debatable question. And I think what we do know is generally the third branch, the judiciary, is unwilling to get between the Congress and the executive as we debate about these questions. So I don't know that anybody will ever call fair or foul on that, but I do think it's really important that Congress roll up its sleeve and get back to precisely what Kane and Corker are saying needs to happen, which is let's make clear to the country what it is we're willing to do, and importantly, what it is we're not willing to do, so that the American people understand what kind of things we're committed to over the course of this ongoing war against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and related associated forces. So should be updated. Kane and Corker have a good opportunity to do so. But this is going to be a political arrangement. It's going to be an aggressive debate, and I hope the White House engages it rather than kind of avoiding it as they have so far.
Well, as you point out, Secretary Mattis clearly sees this issue.
Yeah, Secretary Mattis made it. Look, this was reported in the Times. Maybe it's not exactly correct, but he seemed to suggest that it's his belief that having Congress and the American people through Congress involved on this before we get any more deeply involved is a good idea. I think it's undeniably true that that's correct.
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Natasha Mather, and I'm a fourth year in the Harris School of Public Policy. So earlier, when we were talking about Russia, you spoke about how the White House tried to get its message out through the briefing room, but that was kind of overshadowed by probably more scandalous or more entertaining issues in terms of media coverage. Given that this seems to be the trend in the media in general, it's going towards perhaps more partisan or more sensational issues, do you think the White House should change the way it communicates with the public or its main channels of communication with the public? And especially for post-President Trump administration, perhaps more stable ones, and do you think it has like a responsibility to do so? Thank you.
I think it's a fascinating question, and we were talking about Shayla before, but nobody's thought harder about this question of how do you communicate with the American people? What channels are the American people listening to? Broadly speaking, how do we get our message out to them? And the short answer is yes. I think White Houses need to be more innovative. I think there's different ways to do that, and I think thanks to Shayla, we tried a lot of new techniques. And this is going to be a lot of trial and error, I think. One of the conversations I had when I took the job as chief is I talked to all the living chiefs, one of whom was Secretary Baker, and he told me the most important conversation he had every day was about 5 o'clock. He called the news anchors to let them know what was on the White House mind. And I thought to myself, that's not kind of how it works anymore.
Yeah.
There's a couple turns of the crank after the nightly news, And 50 million people used to watch, 50, 60 million people used to watch the nightly news every night. Now, if we, I think our best State of the Union, which was our biggest square shot at the American people, was about 70 million, right? So, and that was our first. The numbers were some significant degree below that thereafter. So your ability to communicate in one channel to the American people over that channel uninterrupted are now very limited, in which case we got to figure out how we get more clear, aggressive, and competitive out a number of different channels. And I think we made a lot of good advances on that, but I think there's a lot to come.
What do you think about the president's use of Twitter?
Look, I wouldn't. We use Twitter. We had a process on how, as you know very well, how.
What do you think his process is?
It's just you press the tweet button.
There's a danger in it, isn't there?
Yeah. Look, I say to people, you can understand the desire to be communicating directly with your people. You and President Obama, I think, had the best phrase, which is that you always felt like people were looking at you through this funhouse mirror.
Yes.
Which is nobody really sees the president for who he is, but they see him through these various channels, through the funhouse mirrors of Fox or Breitbart or what have you. So everybody's instinct to that is to say, well, let me go communicate directly to my people, State of the Union or even Twitter. Yeah. So you understand the instinct. It's just,
You don't want to hook up your id to the Twitter, though. You want the ego to play some role in the process. In a shameless pander, we've got a man wearing a Notre Dame sweatshirt, which is where you teach.
Yep.
So go ahead.
Go Irish. My name is Mike. I'm a fourth-year medical student. As far as the future of work is concerned, we've recently had Senators Booker and Gillibrand both endorse a federal job guarantee, and then we've had people at Silicon Valley endorse universal basic incomes. Do you think these will be necessary, or do you think there'll be a way forward as we automate jobs to find new jobs that don't require government assistance in this manner?
Yeah, I guess I'm optimistic. I like the big thinking nature of those proposals, and I like being aggressive about the size of the challenge, and I like approaching this with some urgency. And fact is, my general view is that this is not being approached with much urgency at all in the federal government. Increasingly in state and locals, it is. So that I'm very positive about. I'm not as pessimistic as some of those proposals might suggest. And in any case, what I hope we do is not dismantle the existing parts of the social safety net that work quite well in this country. The best evidence of that, I think, is Medicare, which is hugely popular with the people, that is to say seniors 65 and older, who have access to it. In which case, it's a big mistake to try to reduce availability of Medicaid, for example, try to reduce opportunity that comes with the marketplaces and the Affordable Care Act for portability of healthcare benefits. And so I think before jumping to the bigger long-term fixes, let's make sure we stop dismantling the parts of the social safety net that basically entrepreneurs and innovators are making use of right now. And that will be a good start, I think.
Well, let me ask you a question on this work issue. For 6 years after the initial Recovery Act, President Obama tried to get an infrastructure program.
Yes.
We've got trillions of dollars of infrastructure needs. And it seems like a consistent commitment to infrastructure would be a useful thing to do in terms of not just dealing with the nation's backlog of infrastructure problems and challenges that are just going to get worse, but also creating work opportunities for people who may not be on the right side of the digital divide.
Yeah. Look, I think that's right. And I think what an infrastructure bill would allow you to do then also is get some more training and reskilling dollars into the federal budget, and get issues like that remarkably, even in 2018, we're still really far behind on, like access to broadband, as you get more broadband availability across everywhere in this country, which shouldn't be that hard.
Right.
And an infrastructure bill would allow us to do that. Regrettably, having missed the opportunity to do it with President Obama with low interest rates, I think we may have squandered a big opportunity.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your service. I'm a master's student at the Harris School. When I think of Afghanistan, I can't help but draw comparisons to Vietnam, where we find ourselves in a seemingly unwinnable war where every administration does just enough to pass it off to the next. How long can we be there for, and what is a realistic end game?
Yeah, so President Obama and General Dempsey had what I thought was a really interesting and good idea, which is understanding that because of the challenges that come with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and associated forces, establishing a series of platforms where we could train and equip partner forces to take that fight to these insurgent forces that threaten our partners' countries. That is to say, empower them to take the fight to these enemies. And that's how I see Afghanistan, which is how do we ensure that there's sufficient Afghan capability to protect Afghan sovereignty and not allow Afghanistan to be turned into a safe haven again for Al-Qaeda. The same way we've made progress in places like Somalia, which is seeing a much broader swath of space, political space and humanitarian space for Somalis, and North Africa and West Africa. I think if we match our objectives to our willingness to invest, we can be involved in the long haul in a way that protects our interests and empowers our allies. I think when we overstate our objectives, we confuse the American people, we confuse our allies, and we risk then not being able to have the kind of crafted presence that'll allow us to protect our interests for the long term. I hope they get closer to that over the course of these next couple of years as this administration is wrestling with it, because I don't see an alternative to it, because there's got to be something between all in and all out. And I think partnership model is one that I believe we've proved can work. In fact, has worked.
What was your reaction to the move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
It's a move that we avoided taking, as every president before us had avoided taking. I think it is. I believe it was a mistake. As you know, we've debated many times with you and others around the table, Axe, throughout the first and second terms of the administration. We thought it was really important to maintain vital status questions for the negotiators. And we should continue to do that. I think that's the role of the peace broker.
Have we squandered our ability to play the role of broker?
It's hard to tell right now. I worry that we have.
Baxter.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I'm Baxter. I'm a fourth year in the college studying public policy. And today you've talked a lot about sort of the role of artificial intelligence and how it's reshaping the economy here in the US. But my question is more sort of on the global stage. A lot of people have described this, a so-called sort of AI arms race between the US and China, to a lesser extent Russia. Now Macron is really interested in winning this race. And I was just interested to hear what your experience in government has been with this issue and sort of where you see all this competition sort of going, and are you concerned about it?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about it. I think that one of the reasons I want to get involved in this issue relates expressly to geopolitics and competition, which is, I think, twofold. One is, on one hand, if we don't succeed on getting everybody on the right side of this, and Axe's right side, wrong side equation, if we don't succeed in getting everybody on the right side of this, there's real public policy risk, I think, in policymakers trying to slow down innovation rather than increase investment in social access. That would be an historic mistake, because we are in geopolitical competition, including, I think, principally with China. That's point one. Point two, the flip side of the same coin is, I think there's real risk that competition absent norms ends up creating competing AIs, which would be a huge mistake. I was talking to a technologist recently who said she worried about the othering of China, which is, a fine line between geopolitical competition and othering, but I think we have to find that balance, because if we do end up making this a zero-sum game, as some argue the China 2025 proposal of several months ago does, then I think that ultimately means less beneficial outcomes for everybody. So we, I think, succeeded in getting some discussion of international norms going, thanks to President Obama, I think, saw this issue coming. I'm worried that we don't see the same kind of time and resource being dedicated to this issue in this administration. And as a result, I think our ability to maintain that balance of not giving up innovation, but not turning this competition into a zero-sum game is going to be even more delicate.
Thank you.
Yes.
Some Republicans, like Senator Tom Cotton, are fond of saying that Trump is far tougher on Russia than Obama was, and he gives the example of Syria. Shortly before President Obama made his agreement with Putin about chemical weapons, Secretary of State Kerry made a somewhat fiery speech suggesting that an attack would be used not only to send a message on chemical weapons, but to erode Assad's state capacity, and that would be used to give him an incentive to come to an agreement on the negotiations in Geneva. But the administration quickly walked that back. And then one could look at another division that Hillary Clinton wanted.
I need you to get to the question because we're running out of time.
Well, the question is that there were some Hillary Clinton and Secretary Kerry who wanted to take stronger action, but possibly, and here's the question, was there division in the administration, and was the reason President Obama did not follow these more hardline suggestions was that he wanted better relations with Russia?
Yeah, one thing I'm extraordinarily confident of, but also proud of, is that there were a range of views vociferously argued both with and in front of President Obama. That's precisely what he wanted. That's why he chose the Secretaries of State and Secretaries of Defense, for example, that he chose. And so, yeah, were there a variety of views on how best to pursue our interests in Syria? Absolutely. Do I think that the reason that there were a variety of views, or the reason he came out where he came out, because of any one individual factor? No. Do I think that we got the best possible outcome of a very messy set of possibilities in that August-September 2013 experience? I do. I don't see how the insertion of more United States force at that time, in a period when the Syrians had not acknowledged the existence of chemical weapons nor given up massive amounts of them, I don't see how the insertion of more U.S. force would have been a source for greater stability or less dislocation of the millions and millions and millions of Syrians that we've now seen forced from their homes.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Briggs, Tillich. I'm a master's student here at the university. You spoke a little bit in your remarks about in the summer of 2016, we became aware of Russian interest potentially in interfering in the election. You also noted that we were aware at that time that Russia had interfered in, or had intentions to interfere in previous elections elsewhere. So I guess my question is, if we were aware of this intention and we had this information, why didn't we take this threat more credibly? And also, I guess, if you had an opportunity to do it again, how might you have behaved differently with that information?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think that's kind of all the vector of access questions. And one is, I do think the statement that Secretary Johnson and Director Clapper, the statement that they made was an unprecedented statement. And it was a strong statement. It's worth going back to look at. And I wish that would have gotten more traction. There's no question about that. I also wish that
if the president had delivered it, would it have gotten more traction?
I think there's real risk there, Axe, that if the president delivered it himself, that it would have been politicized. And that we did think that the most senior intelligence official and then the cabinet official in charge of our cybersecurity doing it together, we thought that sent a very profound signal. And
the argument is that we were under attack, essentially, and as the commander-in-chief, he was the appropriate person to say that.
I understand the argument. The other argument is that we're in the height of an election, and that if you look at the president's calendar, any day in the president's calendar between the convention and election day, he was out campaigning, and he's the titular head of one party that was contesting the elections. And that the risk is that if he makes that statement in that context, that it loses its mobilizing impact and in fact becomes a more politicized impact.
We have just a couple of seconds left, and it says, wrap it up, please. We are out of time. Nonetheless,
So
I'm
you're going to ask me this question again for the 10th time?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Ooh, a little ouchy. I thought you were
I'm teasing.
chill now that you're out of public life.
know better than to know I'm chill ever.
No, I want you to, I admire you so because
Yes.
your life has been one of service, and you've always approached this as service. And we're the Institute of Politics. We're all about service, not just about elections.
Yeah.
But tell me why you've spent your life this way, and say an encouraging word to young people here who might be thinking of going down that road, because this is kind of a freighted time we're in.
Yeah, that's for sure. I was going to say this when you mentioned the State Department. When you think of very senior people who have left, relatively junior people who are struggling. And I remember there was this guy, his name is Mark Grossman, very senior Foreign Service officer who came back to be our special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan after Ambassador Holbrooke passed. And he used to receive young Foreign Service officers who were unhappy with their career, got a bad assignment, or had a bad manager in their office. And and this is when he was retired, they'd come visit him in his office and they'd say, I think I want to leave. And he says, look, if you want to leave, let me know. Come see me, I'll help you find a job. He says, but look around this room for a second, And they'd all look around the room like you're doing in this room right now. And he says, what do you not see? And some would notice, but some wouldn't. He said, what you don't see in here is the flag. He says, when you're a United States Foreign Service officer, you get to go to work in an office every day that flies the flag of the United States of America. And he says, that is a huge blessing. And so if you're ready to do that, that is to say, not go to work where you fly the flag, then come back and see me. He says, but think about it before you come to see me. And he said, invariably, very few would come back. Some did. And the reason is it's a great feeling of mission, of belonging to a team, and of being a part of history that, for all of our faults, this history has had, as President Obama has argued, a pretty unmistakable bend towards justice. And to be a part of that is a huge opportunity. It's what they call work worth doing. And so not only is it fulfilling, but I'm here to tell you that Uncle Sam needs you. Which is we need undergraduates, we need Harris School graduates, we need the doctors. This country runs on its people. That's the unique experiment that we're engaged in. And the experiment's unresolved, as we've just seen for the last several years. And the experiment only works when we all put our shoulder to the wheel on it. And so I guarantee you, you will not be bored if you take the jobs.
Well,
and you'll meet some pretty cool people along the way.
thank you for your service and for being here today.
Thanks, guys.